Welcome back to Chapter 4's Part 2 of the lecture video. We just got done talking about all the different types of epithelial tissue in Part 1 of this chapter. So now the next main type of tissue we will discuss is the connective tissues, which are the most widely diverse in appearance and function. But they do share three basic components. They all have their own type of specialized cells, including some sort of extracellular fibers, and it is surrounded by what's called a ground substance. The fibers and the ground substance together is what makes up the matrix of the connective tissue. Okay, so make sure you remember the three basic components of the different types of connective tissue. Some have particular type of fibers. Some have all three type of fibers. We'll go through each of these. So the function of connective tissue is very different from epithelial tissue. They are never exposed to the external environment. And usually contain a lot of blood vessels. So they are very vascular and they're not for that type of external abrasion purposes, protection from external abrasion purposes like the epithelial tissue. Like I mentioned before, some of these connective tissues is acting like the styrofoam nuggets that stabilizes and cushions your packages for shipment. So it provides some sort of structural framework for the tissues. So, other than that, they have other specified functions for different types of connective tissue, like transport of fluids and dissolved materials like plasma, lymph, and red blood cells, for example, those blood. They protect delicate organs. That's why that part of that packaging material I was talking about. And some other than protection or packaging, as in underneath your skin, so, sometimes fat tissues also is in charge of storing energy in forms of triglycerides. So we'll talk about adipose tissue in the body and what they're doing. And then some of them are defending body from microorganisms against infection. Again, part of the lymph and the blood of the connective tissues. Lymph is from the lymphatic system, blood is from the circulatory system, but inside blood there are specific types of white blood cells that can be for fighting against those pathogens. So there are three main categories of connective tissues we will discuss. You have connective tissue proper, which are made up of loose and dense connective tissues. So it might get a little bit confusing when we talk about connective tissue due to the fact that there are so many different types of them and their functions are quite different from each other. So that's why we separate it into these three different categories. And within the categories, you have these types of connective tissue. So loose and dense connective tissues are those of the connective tissue proper. Fluid connective tissue is your blood and lymph, which are cells that are suspended within some sort of fluidy or watery matrix. And then you have your supporting connective tissue, which are usually containing dense packed fibers, and those will be your cartilage and your bone tissues. So this would be the most diverse type right here, your connective tissue proper. Fluid is the easiest. It's just blood and lymph, and I'll talk about some of those. And then your supporting connective tissues are those cartilage and bone. All right, so let's start with the general characteristics of connective tissue proper. Its matrix is made up of extracellular fibers and a viscous ground substance. So these, for example, this yellow thick one right here, it's a type of fiber called collagen fiber. The blue line right here is an example of elastic fibers. Collagen fibers, elastic fibers. And these tiny brown ones right here are known as reticular fibers. There are just these three different types of fiber, and all this pink area in here, this background here is what we call ground substance, which is sort of a viscous matrix within that area to slow down the movement of pathogens if there are any. So that's why they are viscous, to slow down the movement of pathogens. So our white blood cells have time to catch up to them. So the types of specialized cells in this type of tissue includes fibroblasts, mesenchymal cells. So fibroblasts and mesenchymal cells are both are in charge of maintenance and repair, whereas adipocytes are in charge of energy storage. And we'll talk about each of these in detail in a bit. There's also a group of immune cells in this type of tissue that is divided into macrophages, mast cells, lymphocytes, and plasma cells. All of them function to defend and repair damaged tissues in their own ways. They have the capacity to also move around and chase down pathogens. And then we'll talk about that process next when we talk about these specialized cells in detail. So these next few slides, we will go over those types of specialized cells I mentioned in a bit more detail. Fibroblasts, for example, are the most abundant type of cells in the connective tissue proper. They secrete proteins that form fibers for structural support. Okay, so mostly they secrete collagen fibers. Mostly. And this is a picture, for example, of fibroblast cells, okay, there. And this is how fibroblasts look like in cartoonish form. They tend to kind of have that star-shaped like structure because they spread around that area to fill up the connective tissue area. So that's why they kind of spread out like star shapes. And then fibrocytes are the second most abundant type of cells within the connective tissue proper. They are usually spindle shaped, okay, so something like this, therefore maintaining your connective tissue fibers, okay, so fibrocytes are these, fibroblasts are these, so make sure you don't confuse the two. It is fibroblasts that actually secrete proteins to form those fibers. Adipocytes are those cells that mainly function for energy storage. Okay, they're what we call fat cells. So fat cells, and they contain, lipids within it, and it is within that lipid molecule, kind of like the triglyceride we mentioned about the in chapter 2 when we talked about macromolecules. They are important. That's how they are able to store energy in forms of triglyceride lipid molecules within the adipocytes. Okay, for adipocytes, you have to make sure you don't confuse them on the microscope with simple squamous epithelium or the alveoli. A lot of students sometimes mix up these two because they look like they have a lot of holes and circles in them. But remember, for simple squamous epithelium of the alveoli, you have a hole, and then you have the entire epithelium, and usually there are multiple nuclei that makes up that simple squamous epithelium. For adipocytes, there's circles and holes, but you only see one nuclei kind of smooshed off to the side. Like this and here, okay? So that's all due to the main part of the cytoplasm of adipocytes is filled with lipids, and that's why it appears like empty on the microscope. But what happens is because the cytoplasm is mainly made of lipids, the nuclei is kind of squeezed off to the side. So that's how you can tell the difference between alveoli versus adipocytes. Is look at the amount of nuclei they have. Okay. All right. So let me. Okay. So then after adipocytes, we have what's called mesenchymal cells. Okay, mesenchymal cells sounds cool. I always thought it kind of is cool pronunciation, but mesenchymal cells are basically stem cells that have the ability to differentiate. We call differentiate, meaning when a stem cells becomes a specific type of cells. That's what differentiation means. So stem cells can differentiate into different types of specialized cells, such as fibroblasts, macrophages, depending on the case necessary. So if it's a local injury that needs to be repaired and regenerated, and which we will talk about in chapter 5, is then fibroblasts will go into there and start regenerating collagen fibers that will reconstruct the structural component part of the connective tissue proper. And if there's pathogens that has entered through the injured site, macrophages will go in there and help fight the pathogen so we don't end up with an infection or bacterial infection of some sort. So mesenchymal cells are a type of stem cells. Melanocytes are those that synthesize and store a molecule, a protein, a pigment called melanin. Okay, melanin is what's able to give us that dark coloration on our skin, hair, okay, and iris as well. So those are, of course, how dark we express these melanin inside different parts of the body depends on multiple genes. It's not just one gene, but multiple genes. But the cells that are in charge of making these proteins are called melanocytes. So melanocytes for melanin. And don't mistake melanin with melatonin. It's completely two different things. Melanin is the pigment. Melatonin is something that's synthesized in the brain that we'll talk about when we get to the brain chapter. Now, the number of melanocytes in different areas depends on body region and individuals. In darker skinned individuals, for example, we'll discuss in the next chapter that they tend to have a lot larger melanocytes and also more numerous amount of melanocytes. Okay, and then these are the different types of white blood cells there can be within the connective tissue proper. We'll just kind of gloss over the gist of what they do. When we get to AMP2 in the blood chapter, we'll go back to these different types of white blood cells in detail. So macrophages are known as the type of immune cells that engulf damaged cells or pathogen using a process called phagocytosis. Okay, its name macrophage literally is derived from the definition of a big eater. Okay, so they kind of roam around your circulatory system looking for signs of attack by pathogens, and if they see something they don't recognize and they see that it's foreign, they will engulf around it. Okay, stretch its arm around it in a sense, and then eat it up into its body. Now, when stimulated, they will release chemicals to recruit more macrophages or other types of defense cells to help with the battle and help with the fight. Sometimes, we understand that, bacteria or other types of pathogen, they reproduce pretty quickly and at an exponential rate. So just one or two macrophages is not enough for the fight, and that's why they would release chemicals to scream for help from other parts of the immune system as well. And here's a quick video that briefly shows how they perform phagocytosis. I'm not gonna let the sound come through. It's just weird, loud music, and we don't need that. Okay, but just to show you that these are, for example, are groups of bacteria there, and then here's a roaming macrophage that are looking for things to engulf. Okay, this is, for example, in the blood vessel, within blood vessel. And here's some bacteria there, and it will just eat it up into its cytoplasm like that and be able to digest them away. And that process is phagocytosis as noted by the video here. Okay, and the bacteria itself will release these traces of toxins which recruits the macrophages for engulfing. Just a gist of what phagocytosis means. All right, so the other type of immune cells, okay, you have mast cells, which is a type of immune cells that are in charge of releasing two very important things, histamine and heparin. Histamine is what stimulates local inflammation. So if you have allergies, you're pretty familiar with antihistamines because you probably are taking that medication all the time. Why it's called antihistamine, excuse me, is because it's preventing the release of histamine. Histamine is what causes local inflammation, which gives you that itchiness of your eyes or itchiness of your nose, and you start having a runny nose and all that stuff. All that as means of an immune reaction against something you don't like or your immune system doesn't recognize. So mast cells are those immune cells that are in charge of releasing histamine that activates the process of inflammation. And we'll talk about the process of inflammation in detail in the last part of chapter 4 lecture. Okay. Heparin is what's acting as an anticoagulant that enhances blood flow during inflammation. As its name suggests, anticoagulant. It doesn't promote coagulation of blood. Coagulation of blood meaning solidifying of the blood. So sometimes blood will coagulate with each other and form clumps, okay, such as forming a blood clot. Okay, so heparin is preventing the area of injury from forming blood clots within that area and also enhance that blood flow. Okay, sometimes there is clotting factors, of course, when for example, if you cut through your skin, a blood vessel is torn and blood starts seeping out of it. So one of the first thing your platelets do, not plasma, platelet cells do is close up the wound, okay? And how they close up the wound is by releasing clotting factors. Well, we don't want those clotting factors to start coagulating in other places where they're not supposed to, that we end up with a bad blood clot within our blood vessels. So that's why they will release heparin to make sure that wherever there's not supposed to be blood clotting, it won't occur. Okay. So basophil is another type of immune cells that perform similar functions as mast cell. They also release histamine and heparin. So that's why I didn't include a definition of basophil, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. They just have the same function as mast cells. Lymphocytes are the immune cells that fight against specific pathogens. So in next semester, when we talk about the lymphatic system, we'll talk about non-specific part of the immune system and specific immunity. So non-specific immunity is done by cells that don't have particular antibodies against a particular bacteria or virus, where specific immunity is for that specific strain of pathogen, and lymphocytes are in charge of that specific type of immunity. And lymphocytes includes two main types of cells, such as T cells and B cells. B cells are the ones that will produce antibodies, and they would actually differentiate into plasma cells, not differentiate, but divide into armies of plasma cells. That plasma cells will become sort of like an antibody factory for that area and starts producing enormous amount of antibody to fight that specific pathogen, whether it be a bacteria or a virus. More for bacteria. And then you have macrophages. So macrophages include specific immune cells called neutrophils and eosinophils. They are also a type of phagocytic blood cells that are attracted to the site of injury by chemicals released by your macrophages. So remember when we talked about macrophages earlier, we said that they release chemicals that will recruit other immune cells to help with the fight. And hence those immune cells, for example, will be neutrophils and eosinophils. And we'll distinguish between these two in the second semester. For now, you can know them by the fact that they do phagocytosis as well, and they're recruited by macrophages. But this is how neutrophils look like. This is how eosinophils look like. Don't worry about identifying these different types of white blood cells by how they look like on the microscopes. I won't ask that in AMP1, okay? But you will be expected to know how to identify the different types of white blood cells by microscopy in AMP2. So for now, just know what they are, the gist of what I have here in as a list of what types of immune cells we have. So there are 3 types of extracellular fibers, as I've mentioned, within the connective tissue proper. You have collagen fibers, which are the thicker ones that I've mentioned, the yellow ones right there. And then you have reticular fibers, which are smaller, and then you have elastic fibers. And in another slide, I'll talk about how each of these are different. And then you have the ground substance, which is this right here, all this pink space all around the entire connective tissue proper that fills all that space between cells and the fibers. They are clear and colorless. Just because it's pink here doesn't mean it's pink in your body. It's just cartoonish style of showing you how the connective tissue proper look like. The ground substance, like I said, is the main point is that they are viscous, which makes pathogens move a lot slower so that your macrophage, for example, have time to sort of catch up and catch whatever pathogen that has gone into the connective tissue proper. For example, you have a cut on your skin. Now your skin is exposed to different bacteria on the outside world in the environment, and let's say a bacteria has gone in and starts swimming around in the ground substance. At least the ground substance being viscous can slow this down so that macrophage can come around and engulf and eat this pathogen up if it was in there. All right, so let's go through the 3 different types of fibers and how are they different, okay? So collagen fibers are usually the most abundant type of fibers. They're long, straight, and usually unbranched. So that's why you see these long, thick pink lines here. Okay, so that's what I mean by, it's hard to tell. I mean, cartoon image is always easy to tell what fiber is what, but in reality, tissues are just all pink and purple because they are all staining with the same type of stain called H&E staining. And hence, tissues, technically speaking, are clear on the microscope, but they do a H&E stain to make things show up a little better, but they are all pink and purple, and that's why it's hard to recognize them. But collagen fibers, you can't mistake them because they're usually thick like this. Okay, so any thick lines you're seeing is a type of collagen fibers all over in this place. Okay. So for example, in tendons and ligaments, there will be lots of these type of collagen fibers that we'll talk about when we get to the specific kind of loose and dense connective tissue. Tendons are, I'll mention this again, but, let's talk about it here while we're at it. Tendons are those that connect muscles to bones, whereas ligaments are those that connect bone to bone. So I still remember one of my students always say, oh, okay, one easy to remember is liggy bone bone. Okay, so you can remember that, liggy bone bone. So you can never forget ligaments is what connects bones to bones, especially at joints. For example, if you look at your hands right now, all those joints that are existing within your fingers, those finger joints are bound and wrapped around by lots of ligaments that make sure your fingers don't move out of place. Your different phalanges would not, and the metacarpals, they won't move out of place, and you have a displaced finger. So that's why a lot of our joints are reinforced by ligaments, okay, to keep the joints in place. And then tendons is what connects muscles to bones, kind of like a little tape. The tape makes sure the muscles stay with the bones, because if the muscles move but it's not attached to bones, we won't have movement. Okay, a lot of our movement are possible is because during muscle contraction, it pulls the bones for a particular movement we want to do. Okay. All right, reticular fibers are have the same subunit as collagen fibers, still made of the same type of protein, but they are thinner and forms branching and interwoven network. Okay, so for example, you see these tiny ones here. Okay, they are kind of forming that lots of little lines coming out, lots of little lines like that. Those are your reticular fibers, and that interwoven network or framework is called stroma. They're usually flexible and yet still strong. They can position and stabilize positions of cells and blood vessels, nerves, and organs. Okay, whereas collagen fibers is mainly the structural support to uphold all those epithelial tissues above, and if there's muscular tissues, then that's what they're upholding. Okay, collagen fibers. Elastic fibers are those that are branched and wavy. So these, okay, there are branches, but you can tell that they are a little bit thicker than reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are the thinnest type of fibers. Collagen are the thickest type. And then elastic is the middle ground where they are kind of not as thick as collagen, but not as thin as reticular fibers. Okay, they're thick because they need to have that flexibility of being able to stretch. Okay, and that's why they are called elastic fibers, is because they have the ability to stretch with the protein elastin. Okay, so reticular and collagen fibers both have similar protein subunits. Elastic fiber, what's special about them is that they have that protein elastin that makes them stretchy. Okay, so for example, there are elastic ligaments in interconnecting vertebrae. That's for your intervertebral disc, if you have heard of that before. Your vertebrate bones are in stacks like this on your spine, and between them is sandwiched disc of cartilage, and including elastic ligaments, okay, that helps with the flexibility of our spine to do, curves and wiggle our waist, etc., okay, or bend our back. Now we will go into the different specific kind of tissues that are within the connective tissue proper category. There are two main types of tissue for connective tissue proper: the loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Adipose is an example of loose connective tissue, and tendons is an example of dense connective tissue. But I will talk about all the different examples that you have to know. So there are 4 specific kinds of loose connective tissue. Each of them have their own specialized cells, and they mainly function as packing materials of the body. They will fill spaces between organs, cushion them, stabilize them, and support the epithelia that is superior to it usually. First up is your embryonic connective tissue. Okay, this, as the name suggests, is only in embryos. It is not in adults. Remember, we said that the mesenchymal cells are stem cells, so embryonic connective tissue has a lot of mesenchyme. Okay, so mesenchyme is one of the 2 types of tissue within, or cells within the embryonic connective tissue. So they are stem cells that will give rise to all other connective tissue within the embryo themselves. Okay, so usually they're star-shaped stem cells. So you see here or here. So that will mean by star-shaped is something like that. Okay, and then you have the other type of connective tissue within embryos is mucous connective tissue, or another name for them is Wharton's jelly. They are loose connective tissue that are found in many parts of the embryo. Okay, if you look at videos of embryos, they always make the embryo look as if it's kind of like jello-like and clear and opaque, somewhat see-through. So that's all part of this Wharton's jelly. That will eventually become something else as the embryo continues to grow and develop within the mom's womb. So adults don't have either type of these embryonic connective tissue. And again, this is only for lecture purposes. Okay, lab, you won't be expected to know embryonic connective tissue. So that's why for lab, you always go back to your lab exercises for what you need to know on the lab practical. Lecture exam, you go to lecture slides for what you need to know on the lecture exams, okay? All right, so, and then moving on to the second specific kind of loose connective tissue, which is called the areolar tissue, which is that nice picture I was showing you earlier that shows the 3 fibers and the ground substance. That's an example of areolar tissue, which pretty much is an open framework of ground substance that makes up most of the volume of areolar tissue. The fibers are loosely organized, so that's why this is a type of loose connective tissue. There's no package or pattern in how these fibers are aligning against each other. Okay. So these type of loosely packaging of the connective tissue is what allows your organs or tissues to distort without damaging anything underneath. For example, if you look at pleura that surrounds the lungs, that's how the areolar tissue looks like underneath, that it has some elastic fibers, those collagen fibers, and also those different types of cells we talked about associated with the connective tissue proper. So this is a layer that will separate skin from deeper structure, usually these areolar tissue, and it is also the most common injection site for drugs due to their extensive blood supply. Remember, the main difference between epithelial cells and connective tissue is that epithelial cells are avascular, while connective tissue has a lot of vascularity, okay, a lot of blood vessels around. So that's why if you've had baby before and you've seen your baby take vaccines before, they usually go at the thigh of the baby, and you see the nurse is not aiming somewhere, it's just going anywhere around the thigh and just punching that needle into the thighs. Is because underneath all that skin and fat are these areolar tissues within there, that there is enough blood supply within those areolar tissue that is gonna hit a blood vessel, and in a sense delivering the drug to the circulatory system for the rest of the body to be exposed to the medication or the drug in the vaccination. Okay. So you have the third specific kind of loose connective tissue, which is your adipose tissue. and the specialized cells within this tissue are called adipocytes, like I've talked about earlier. So adipose tissues is what provides padding, absorbs shocks, acts as insulator, serve as filler around ground structures, all that good stuff. Okay, so most of the adipose tissue in the body is what we call as white fat, which is that pale white yellow color that we're seeing in under the microscope. Just recently, we have discovered that adults also have brown fats. Previously, they thought it was only existent in babies, but now we know that they also exist in adults. Brown fat is deeper and has a richer color. That's what we call them, brown fat. But they are highly vascularized and contains lots of mitochondria. So hence, because they have mitochondria for burning calories and making ATPs, they can generate heat very quickly. So it's been shown in research that brown fat is what gets activated when we're in very, very cold temperature. Not that we should go in the freezer and start freezing ourselves to lose fat, but that's what brown fat is for warming our bodies, okay? But don't try to put yourself in a cold situation just so you can burn those brown fat, because they do burn more calories, but it's just for heating purposes, okay? All right, so, and in adults, usually the places in the body that has these brown fat is around the neck area for warmth, which is usually it's our neck that's exposed to the outside. Okay, now, when nutrients are scarce, okay, remember adipose tissues is what's providing that energy storage. So when nutrients are scarce, we need to, burn some of that fat from our adipose cells. The adipocytes will actually deflate, okay, in size, sort of going from really, very round to small little shrunken state to release the fatty acid. And when nutrients are plentiful, they will swell in size and become larger. So that's why you end up with layers of adipose tissue, what we know as fat, when we eat a lot of food that we don't burn for energy. Okay. And hence, this is why in plastic surgery, there's a procedure called liposuction, which is a cosmetic procedure for removing excess adipose tissues. But remember that it is temporary because our body is already created and sort of designed to create these adipose tissues from scratch. Okay, so if we eat a lot, we will just make more fat cells. Okay, so that's why liposuction is temporary and in a sense risky, because it is something that's not naturally happening in the body. So it is sort of a surgical cosmetic intervention. And if we go back to our eating habits before liposuction, adipose tissue can always regenerate because mesenchymal cells, as our stem cells, will just differentiate into more adipose cells as places to store all that calories we're not burning away, okay, or lipids and fats molecules. Okay, so the last specific kind of loose connective tissue is the reticular tissue. This is the easiest type to recognize on the microscope because they're the only one that looks dark and brown like this, okay? One of the few, like I was talking about, that is not pink and purple with H&E staining. The reticular tissue always appears kind of that dark yellow brownish color due to the nature of the tissue itself, okay? They're mainly made up of reticular fibers that form a three-dimensional stroma that is for supporting cells of the organs such as your liver, kidney, and spleen. Lymph nodes and bone marrow as well have reticular fibers. So for example, this is reticular tissue from the liver specifically, but when you look at reticular tissue from the spleen, it looks very similar in that brown yellowish color, just like this. So since the first lab practical involves a lot of tissue identification, that's the toughest part of lab practical 1, you will need to get used to seeing histology pictures of these tissues so you can distinguish between them. So here are pictures of the 3 specific kinds of loose connective tissue that we were just talking about, and it will be tested on the lab practical as well. So might as well go through it here. How can you distinguish between them? Well, first of all, the type of tissue for all 3 is loose connective tissue. So this is the type of tissue. So what are the specific kind of tissue for all 3 pictures? So for here, there's lots of fibers going everywhere. There's nuclei of fibroblasts everywhere. Okay, so that's the distinguishing feature of areolar tissue. Okay, areolar tissue, lots of fibers spreading across, and there's nuclei everywhere. Okay, now for this picture, you see lots of holes, lots of circles, bubbly looking things, but you don't see dots. Okay, remember I said simple squamous epithelium is when you see nuclei all around the circles. Well, we don't see dots all around the circles. We see a dot smooshed to the side here, a dot smooshed to the side here, a dot smooshed to the side here. So it is not simple squamous epithelium, but adipose tissue. Okay, adipose tissue. And the one I said easiest to distinguish amongst all the tissues are the dark brown ones, okay, which usually means it's the reticular type of tissue. Okay, and the 4th type of tissue was embryonic connective tissue, but I said that wasn't going to be on the lab practical, so that's just for lecture exam purposes. Okay, so make sure you know the type, okay, which is loose connective tissue, and the 3 specific kind, the name of these tissues. I will give you more examples of these different pictures for the lab practical, but what you see on the lab exam may not be exactly these same pictures, but you should be able to distinguish between the tissues based on what we talked about in this lecture, how to distinguish them, what are some features you can look for specific kinds of tissues. All right, the other type of connective tissue proper is the dense connective tissue. They're similar to loose connective tissue, but now they're densely packed with stuff, okay? And they usually look a lot, kind of organized or more filled with lines and stuff. Okay, you'll see what I mean when I talk about them. Okay, so there are three specific kinds of dense connective tissue. They're usually called collagenous because there are lots of collagen fibers for those dense connective tissue. They're densely packed with those collagen fibers. So the first specific kinds of dense connective tissue is called the dense regular. The keyword there is regular connective tissue. Why keyword is dense and regular is because the collagen fibers will always appear parallel and packed tightly. Okay, so that's why it's regular, because they're all in wavy lines like this, nice and next to each other. Remember areola tissues, the collagen fibers were kind of like this all over the place. Okay, there's no specific pattern. Well, regular is what tells you that there's a pattern to it, and they are kind of lining parallel against each other, just like this, and they're packed very tightly next to each other. So that's why there's a keyword there, dense. Okay, so examples of the dense regular connective tissues are tendons and ligaments. Tendons are those, like I was talking about, attach muscles to bones, and ligaments are those that connect to bone, okay, within a joint, for example. So remember, leggy, bone, okay, ligaments, bone to bone. Now, aponeurosis is a larger, broader type of tendon sheets that attaches wider and flatter muscles to another muscle, or even several bones sometimes, because we talked about tendons as attaching muscles to bones. And we tend to think of tendons like a strip like this that connects to muscles like that, and that's the tendon that attaches the bone. Well, some of the tendons on the body is actually a big piece of white tendon that you see on models, like for example the epicranius, which is the up on top of your head, what connects your forehead muscles to the back of your head muscles. That piece of big white tendon is called the aponeurosis, because it's a big piece of tendon that attach the muscles to bones of the skull and to other muscles of the back of your head. So that's why here it says those associated with large muscles of the skull, lower back, abdomen. We'll talk about these aponeurosis when we get to the muscle lab, where you have to identify a few specific aponeurosis when you get to that muscle identification lab. Okay, so the second specific kind of dense connective tissue is called dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so the keyword there is dense but irregular, which indicates that this kind of tissue still has that densely packed collagen looking like things, okay, lines all over the place, but they are irregular. They're not parallel to each other. They're interwoven meshwork with no consistent pattern, okay, and they function to strengthen and support areas subject to stress. For example, your dermis. So this is, for example, is a cross section of your skin. This layer here is known as the epidermis, that we'll learn about in the next chapter. This layer here is the dermis layer. And a lot of the dermis layer is made up of this dense, irregular connective tissue, just like here, all of this. And you can tell what I mean by irregular. There's no nice parallel lines like what we saw with tendons and ligaments earlier, but there's just lines and stuff everywhere. And that's how it looks like on the microscope. It's just weird swirly lines here, long lines here. There's no set pattern, but yet there's densely packed with lines of stuff, okay? So that's dense, irregular connective tissue. Common areas that you will find this kind of tissue, like I said, is the dermis layer of the skin, but also capsules. So there are capsule layer that surrounds organs, soft organs like liver, kidneys, and spleen, to protect that organ from stress, mechanical stress. So those capsules are also made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. In the perichondrium, which are those those tissues that surround cartilages in joints are also made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Periosteum, which is an external layer that surrounds your bones. We'll talk about that in chapter 6 when we go over skeletal system. Okay, there's a layer of connective tissue that wraps tightly around your bones. That's called a periosteum, and they're made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Again, here's that prefix peri, whether it's perichondrium or periosteum. Peri is the prefix that means outside, okay, the outside layer. And then the other root word has to do with what it surrounds. So it's perichondrium, outside layer of chondrocytes, which is cartilage. Okay, chondrocytes are cells of the cartilage. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then you have outside layer of osteum. Osteum always has to do with bones. Okay, whatever. Those are usually dealing with something with your bones. So those external layer of your bones. The third specific kind of dense connective tissue is called the elastic tissue. Now, don't confuse this with elastic fibers, okay? So elastic fibers is what makes up your elastic tissue, okay? So fibers are proteins, long lines within the tissue itself. Elastic tissue, it's a specific kind of tissue within the dense connective tissue type, okay? So they're, like I said, elastic tissue is made up of elastic fibers like this, and they of course function for springy and recoiling capabilities of that particular tissues. So these are usually found in between vertebrae of spinal column, okay, because like I said, a lot of the weight we carry is sort of distributed within our skeleton, and especially our back as well. So our back is what holds up. That's why how you sit in that posture is very important, because your back bones, our vertebrate bones, is what helps your main trunk of your body stand up and support its weight. So part of those intervertebral discs within the vertebrate has to have this elasticity for compression of the compressibility of these vertebrate bones. Okay. So they also support walls of large blood vessels, like the, for example, aorta. We'll talk about different types of blood vessels in the next chapter. For now, you don't have to know them. But just know that large blood vessels are supported by elastic tissue underneath your epithelium. And then you have erectile tissue and skin of the penis that's also made up of elastic tissue, and sometimes around respiratory airways as well, both. And I already talked about the vertebrates of the spinal column for that compressibility of the of your vertebrate bones as it's supporting our weight. Okay, again, time for tissue identification. The type of tissue is dense connective tissue type. So that's this type of tissue. And the specific kind of tissue represented by these three pictures is, what is this? Well, there's lots of lines we're seeing going across. Are they interwoven with each other, or are they nice and parallel? They're nice and parallel. So for sure, we're going to know, well, that's regular if it's nice and parallel with each other. Well, are they all over the place? Sort of lots of lines densely packed together? Yeah, pretty much. So that's why this is dense, regular, connective tissue. And this is particularly in tendons or ligaments. I won't ask you to distinguish between the two on exams, okay? As long as you tell me it's tendons or ligament, then it's fine. Now, this is interesting. Well, this is nicely packed, but you see these squiggly lines, okay? So squiggly lines means it can recoil, okay? Probably has some elasticity to it. So this is a type of elastic tissue, okay? Now this, there are two layers. But I would, if on the exam, I would ask for this layer for this particular type of connective tissue. Now, this is our usual layer of stratified squamous epithelium. okay, of the skin. But what's underneath here is the dermis layer, and you see densely packed with stuff and lines, but is not really in a set pattern. There's no set pattern. There's lines swirling here. There's a straight line all of a sudden here, and then a horizontal line all of a sudden here. So it doesn't have a set pattern, and that's why this is your dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay? All right. So dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, and that's all we went over for dense connective tissue, the 3 specific kinds of dense connective tissue. Now, before we go into the other main types of connective tissue, there's a special kind of connective tissue called fascia. So fascia are then kind of like saran wrap, okay? So don't confuse serous membrane with fascia. Remember, serous membrane are like Ziploc bags, okay? Whereas fascia then are the saran wraps, okay? They don't have that double membrane or fluid in between the double membrane, okay? Fascia are just layers that goes around organs as means of support or separating or attachment of different layers of tissue. There are 3 different layers of types of fascias. The most outer layer is called the superficial fascia, which by its name you already know is the most outer layer, if you know what superficial means. And then the layer, so the superficial fascia, for example, like this layer really right here, is usually made up of areolar and adipose tissue, and is what separates your skin from the underlying tissues underneath, whether it be muscles or other connective tissue, and provides that insulation and padding because it has adipose tissue. Deep fascia are any of these white. You see this white layer here, white layer here, or white layer here. Any of those 3 layers are called the deep fascia, okay? So these lines actually lines up with what they are. So deep fascia are sheets of dense, regular connective tissue that are interwoven, and they're what binds those structural elements together, kind of like your basement membrane, if you remember from the epithelial tissue. But now we're talking about between layers of different types of tissue. And then you have subserous fascia, which is this layer right here. Subserous fascia. Okay, subserous fascia. Okay, which is that line right there. So subserous fascia, as its name suggests, sub-serous. So remember, sub means under or inferior to. So underneath the serous membrane. So this is a layer of areolar tissue that lies between the deep fascia and your serous membrane that line the body cavities to prevent distortion of any sort while you're moving around and doing your twists and bends as you're exercising or stretching. Okay? Now, on to the last 2 main types of connective tissue, which is your fluid connective tissue and the supporting connective tissue. Fluid connective tissue is very easy. It's just blood and lymph. Supporting connective tissue, you have 3 kinds of cartilage to know, and bone cells, bone tissue. Let's start with fluid connective tissue. Okay, it is only made of 2 specific kinds of tissue, which is your blood and lymph. Blood, we have already mentioned, many different types of white blood cells earlier with the connective tissue proper as defense against pathogens. So white blood cells are for fighting against infections and diseases or any pathogens, like foreign invaders in your body. Red blood cells is what mainly serves for oxygen delivery and carrying carbon dioxide toward the lungs. So they are for gas transport. So transport oxygen and brings carbon dioxide back to the lungs for you to drop off. And then you have platelets as well. So red blood cell for oxygen, and then platelets are for clotting purposes. Okay. So wherever there's a cut in the skin or blood vessel, platelets would rush to that area and sort of aggregate in that area, like I've talked about as an example of positive feedback in chapter 1. Now, you don't have to worry about arteries, veins, and capillaries for now. We'll talk about this in AMP 2. Lymph is the fluid that is circulating around our lymphatic system, so they help to regulate levels of nutrients, waste, toxins, maintain blood volume, and also, of course, most important function, alert immune system to infection. So we'll talk about how some of our lymph vessels have these particular one-way valves that traps pathogens once a pathogen has entered the circulatory system, and from there they move on to the lymphatic system, or somehow from other places into the lymphatic system. Well, they have just walked into kind of like a mousetrap. Okay, once they're in there, they're trapped in there, and there's gazillion of immune cells within our lymphatic system to help fight the pathogen. And that's why we trap them there, so that we can allow our macrophages, neutrophils, whatever it is, those immune cells that will attack and kill off those foreign invaders of the body. Okay? All right, so for the red blood cells and fluid connective tissue is very straightforward. The easiest, in addition to reticular tissue, the easiest type of tissue to recognize, because red blood cells are just these red circles, oval shaped things here. And again, like I said, I won't expect you to know the different types of white blood cells yet, but just know that these purple things that are bigger, usually bigger in size than red blood cells, are your white blood cells. Okay? And then the last type of connective tissue is your supportive connective tissue, which includes two general categories. You have cartilage and bones. So cartilage is a firm gel that contains a polysaccharide called chondroitin sulfates. Okay, chondroitin sulfates. So cells of the cartilage are called chondrocytes, like I was saying earlier with perichondrium. So chondrocytes are the specialized cells of the connective tissue, cartilage. Okay, and these chondrocytes are kind of living in small little pockets or chambers within the tissue called lacuna. Okay, so lacunae for plural form, lacuna without the E for singular form. Now, in contrast to other types of connective tissue, cartilage is actually avascular, meaning no blood vessels, just like your epithelial tissue. So these cells gather nutrients and get rid of waste through diffusion. So make sure you remember that cartilage cells or cartilage tissues are avascular. This also explains why, compared to other types of connective tissue, cartilage usually heals very poorly, if at all. If cartilage are damaged during accidents in sports, for example, they often require some surgical intervention to help with the healing process, either by sanding down the cracks or, sort of the lumps or cracks that's formed by the accident, or sometimes it may even involve growing cartilage tissues outside in a lab setting and then re-injecting those cells back into the cartilage area, just because these cartilage usually have a hard time healing because they are avascular. And the reason why cartilage don't have any blood vessels is because chondrocytes are programmed to release something called anti-angiogenesis factor, which prevent blood vessel formation. Again, here's another good word for knowing all the different parts of the word and you know what it means. So anti for not making or opposite of, okay? And then angio usually means blood vessels, genesis, development. So no, let me get to my pointer. Where's my pointer? Okay. No blood vessel genesis development. Okay, so no blood vessel development factor in a sense. So that's why I said in anatomy and physiology, and you'll learn this if you ever have to take medical terminology as well, is that if you know these root words or prefixes and suffixes, then you have a good idea of what that word means, even though you may have never seen that word before. okay, or forgot what that word means on the exam, don't panic. Identify as much prefixes or suffixes or root words that you can and try to guess which one makes sense, okay? So anti-angiogenesis factor is what chondrocytes in cartilage tissue will release to prevent blood vessel formation, okay? Which actually is what our anti-cancer therapy research is modeling for to help fight cancer, is stop cancer cells from forming blood vessels. Remember, we talked about in the cancer cell chapter, chapter 3, I talked about how cancer and tumors are able to create new blood vessels. So if we can stop that process, we can stop their growth as well. Okay, so cartilage is divided into 3 specific kinds of supportive connective tissue. One being called hyaline cartilage, which is the most common type of cartilage around the body. They're tough yet flexible and contain packed collagen fibers, but not large bundles. So that's why you don't see lines going like this. You don't see that for hyaline cartilage like what you see in dense regular connective tissue, ligaments, and tendons. But you do see one line here, sometimes here, very faintly, but it's because they're not tightly packed, okay? Not large bundles of them together. But what I was talking about in terms of lacuna or lacunae is these small little chambers, okay? And I like to alert my students, say, if you see little eyeball-looking things on this picture or a slide, it's most likely hyaline cartilage, okay? Because this is just a small glimpse of it. I'll show you another picture for more zoom-out view of hyaline cartilage, and they literally look like little eyeballs, okay? My previous students always says so. Oh, yeah, they do look like eyeballs, okay? So eyeballs for hyaline cartilage. Like I said, anatomy has so much stuff to remember. You have to come up with your own little creative ways to remember all this stuff easily, okay? All right, so hyaline cartilage have chondrocytes, which are these cells. You see the nuclei of the cells that resides within the lacunae of the hyaline cartilage area, okay? So hyaline cartilage are usually in connections between ribs and the sternum, nasal cartilage, supporting cartilages of the airways, articular cartilages, and you can tell from these different example locations that hyaline cartilage is not usually in places where it's exposed to mechanical stress or constant compression that can resist a lot of weight, okay? You won't, put your nose in front of a wall and see how much you can compress your nose, okay? That's hyaline cartilage in the nose. So it's not meant to stand very, very heavy pressure or compression, okay? So that's why hyaline cartilage is mainly for, sort of keeping that shape of that part of the body, or, making sure one bone the joint between two bones are somewhat flexible, and that's why it's between the ribs and the sternum. Sternum is that middle bone that covers up your chest. And hence, when you breathe in, breathe out, your ribs kind of, expand in size and contract in size as well. So what allows for that slight movement of the ribs with respective to your sternum is existence of these hyaline cartilage that provides that small bit of flexibility, okay? So that's why it's the most common type, because it's kind of everywhere as what's holding the shape of those particular organs. Okay, so the second specific kind of cartilage or supportive connective tissue is elastic cartilage. Okay, so there are 3 elastic stuff we're talking about here. Don't get confused with the 3 of them. There's elastic fiber, elastic tissue, and elastic cartilage, okay? Elastic fibers are the proteins that has elastin in them, okay, in lines that gives the tissue the ability to recoil and have that elasticity. Elastic tissue is a type of loose connective tissue, okay? Dense connective tissue. Elastic tissue is a type of dense connective tissue. Remember those little squiggly lines all over the place, okay? So that's elastic tissue, okay? A type of dense connective tissue. Okay, elastic cartilage is a type of supportive connective tissue that is a type of cartilage, is a not a type of dense connective tissue. Okay. So elastic cartilage compared with hyaline cartilage is very resilient and flexible at the same time. So that's why they have a lot of elastic fibers within the tissue, okay? Because they allow for more flexibility, and yet they're a little bit more resilient in terms of toughness compared to hyaline cartilage. So usually areas of the body that have elastic cartilage are external flaps of the outer ear, for example, right here, epiglottis, which is sort of that little trap door that covers over your trachea when you swallow food, so that whatever you drink or eat does not go down to the airway but slides behind into the esophagus. And then you have your auditory canal is also made of elastic cartilage, and also small cartilages within the larynx, which is your voice box. Larynx is your voice box. Again, something we'll go over in the next semester's A&P. Okay, so how you can distinguish elastic cartilage compared to hyaline cartilage is you still have eyeballs, but not like spread out eyeballs. Okay, you see these lacuna still. Okay, lacunae, where with their chondrocytes in between them. What's distinguishing about elastic cartilage is all these purple lines, okay, all this purple stuff that surrounds the chondrocytes, because they are packed with elastic fibers. That's why there's all these purple lines around them, okay? So purple lines around them means elastic cartilage, okay? And then the last type of cartilage is called fibrocartilage, which are the most durable and toughest of the three. That's why they're fibrocartilage. Sounds like, ooh, fiber, lots of fiber and power, okay? They have very little ground substance, okay, because they're densely packed with all those fibers. Those same interwoven collagen fibers we were talking about in dense regular connective tissue, same thing. They're packed with these, but they're a type of cartilage, not dense regular connective tissue, okay? So areas where there's fibrocartilage usually resist a lot of compression, can absorb shocks, prevent damage in bone-to-bone contact, and limit movement beyond a certain point. Okay, so for example, with elastic tissues of the ears, you can bend your ears. I remember some people's ears, you can actually fold them up into little areas and stuff them inside your ear canal. I don't have that big of ears, so I can't do that, but I've seen people that can. Well, that's because they have elastic cartilage, very flexible, okay, and elastic, okay, whereas fibrocartilage is not meant to give you that same flexibility. It's meant to give you cushion, okay, cushion for a lot of weight. So that's why example locations where fibrocartilage is usually around areas where there's a lot of weight-bearing bones or muscles. So for example, intervertebral discs between vertebrate bones, those little jelly clear blue area there, those are your intervertebral discs, and they're highly made up of fibrocartilage, so that your bones, that's, your vertebrate bone here won't just smush next to the next vertebrate bones, okay? The intervertebral disc does, however, can degenerate over time, and that's why in older individuals, they can end up with a smush intervertebral disc called bulging disc, and it can displace out of place called herniated disc, and that herniated disc can actually sit on the spinal nerve that can cause a lot of pain, and we'll talk about that when we get to the joint chapter. Chapter 9, okay? So intervertebral disc is mainly made up of fibrocartilage to withstand all that weight and compression around tendons and within joints, okay? For example, the knee, or even between those of pubic bones and the pelvis, okay? See, pads within the knee joints, such as the meniscus, for example. We'll talk about that in chapter 9, the joint chapter as well. But the pubic bones, which is your pelvis, okay, is another huge bone in your body that upholds a lot of weight, okay? So that's why within the pelvis, those cartilage are usually fibrocartilage as well, okay? All right, so it's just as the same as the other cartilage cells. There's still those little eyeballs, but I would look for lots of these lines around the eyeballs, okay? So no lines in hyaline cartilage, just spread out eyeballs everywhere. For elastic cartilage, there are eyeballs, but there's lots of purple lines, okay, in a concentrated area. Fibrocartilage looks a lot larger in area. There's lots of these lines in a straight, parallel processes, and there's still these eyeballs where there are chondrocytes residing in the lacunae. Okay, all right, so let's get through the last supportive connective tissue before I go over the different microscopic pictures of these connective tissue. So the last specific kind of supportive connective tissue is the bone, or known as osseous tissue. So osseous usually means something to do with the bone, okay? So the cells that make up this type of tissue are called osteocytes, okay? So osteocytes right here. So chondrocytes for cartilage, osteocytes for bone. So that's why you have to remember those words, okay? Chondrocyte starts with a C for cartilage. Osteocyte, we already know osteo has something to do with the bone. But both of them reside in pockets called lacunae. So same thing for bone. So these, you see these little pockets right here, okay? Or these black dotted areas within layers of the bones. Those are all lacunae with osteocytes residing in them. Now, 2/3 of the bone matrix is made up of calcified material, including calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. I'll talk about these in detail in the next chapter 6 for the skeletal system. Rest of them are collagen fibers, okay? Wherever there's supposed to be serving as structural support, you will see collagen fibers, okay? And all of this stuff, the calcified portion is what gives bones strength. The collagen fibers is what gives bones a little bit of flexibility. Not like we can bend our femur or our tibia any way we want, okay? But it can stand some bending, a little slight bending, but not completely breaking it in half, okay? All right, so bone surfaces, other than those that are in the joint cavities, okay, are covered by periosteum. I already mentioned that before. And periosteum is a type of dense, irregular connective tissue. It helps with attaching bones to surrounding tissue and associated with tendons and ligaments. Okay, so the ability for tendons to attach muscles to bones is because we have this periosteum layer. Okay. Now, contrary to cartilage tissue, bones can repair themselves completely after injury because there are blood vessels. You see right here in the central canal, those are blood vessels, okay, vein and artery. So because they have blood supply, they will heal after an injury. Okay, I will talk about fractures and what goes on with healing process of the fractures in chapter 6. Bones also will grow thick and strong with exercise, but if you don't move it around a lot, they will become thin and brittle. And that's why people, those astronauts that are working in the space station in outer space, they still have to go on their treadmills and bicycles, not treadmills, probably bicycles, exercising bicycle to make sure they work their muscles, or else when they come back to Earth, when they're now no longer floating around in space, they have to use their muscles to walk. Their muscles could have atrophy so much that they have difficulty walking. So to prevent atrophy, which means deterioration of particular type of tissue, such as your muscle tissue, they have to do that, sort of that bicycle exercising in space, even though they're kind of floating around and not walking around. Okay, so that is to prevent their bones and muscles from becoming weak and useless. All right, so let's end this part with the identification of different types of tissue. So this here is a zoom out view of the trachea, which is your airway. Okay, so this is that hollow space within for air to pass through, and this is that tissue around. Now, if we zoom in to this area, so this is a zoom in view of the trachea. if we look at that particular section and zoom into that particular area, this is how it would look like. This here was that pseudostratified, I'm just going to abbreviate, okay? Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And remember we said in the trachea, there's also accessory glands called goblet cells. See these clear cells, clear looking cells here, here, and very obvious too here. Okay, so those are your goblet cells for secreting mucus on the surface of the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So that's the epithelial layer, okay? Underneath the epithelial layer, you have all of these eyeballs I was talking about. So this is the hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage that resides below your pseudostratified columnar epithelium within the trachea. So you see how there's chondrocytes within lacunae looking like little eyeballs everywhere. You don't see lines going in between them. There's no lines and there's no dark purple areas. So that's what distinguish this from other type of cartilage is hyaline cartilage, okay? Here, very obvious, looks very different from hyaline cartilage. There's still eyeballs everywhere, like here, everywhere. And then, but you see these dark purple lines I was talking about that goes around the lacunae. So those are your elastic fibers that surrounds the elastic cartilage, okay? So this particular area is the elastic cartilage, specific kind. And fibrocartilage. So this is a zoom out view of fibrocartilage, which is this whole area right there. And if we zoom in, we will see something like this. Okay, so fibrocartilage, but zoom in view. Okay, so you see that there's still eyeballs. There are chondrocytes within the lacunae, but you see lots of lines, okay? Lots of lines everywhere, okay? So those are the, collagen fibers that's supporting this part of the cartilage, okay? So now you can distinguish, how to tell the difference between these three types of supportive connective tissue. So the type of all three specific kinds of tissue, the type is supportive connective tissue, and the specific kind is hyaline cartilage within the trachea, elastic cartilage, for example, in the ear flaps, okay, or epiglottis, and then fibrocartilage in intervertebral disc, okay. All right, so those are the three types of supportive connective tissue. So bones cells is right here. It's pretty easy to tell. You can't miss bone because they look like little logs, cross-section of logs going across, okay? And for bones, you need to know osteocytes within the lacunae. And we'll talk about these other features when we get to chapter 6, so don't worry about it for now. Okay. All right. So let's pause the video and we will continue in part 3 of chapter 4 for connective tissue, the rest of for all types of tissues. And we will continue with nervous and muscular tissue in part 3.